very much. It's indeed a tough gig. Last one in the session, and I've got none of the colour and vibrancy of those previous presentations, which are terrific. So anyway, I'll try and keep it punchy and efficient, and see you through the end of the day's proceedings. The Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre is an economic and social research organisation centred at Curtin University. It's independent but is supported through generous contributions from Bankwest. Our mission is to conduct research and analysis on economic and social policy issues of relevance to WA, and in doing so we hope to contribute to the sustainability of the state and the well-being of WA households. So in that context, it's a real pleasure to be here to talk through some of my reflections on aspects of population and community in the Wheatbelt, and what I think are some of the take-homes in relation to the development and continued strengthening of this region. I'm hoping to go through 4 themes, as you see there. Starting with some demographic profile data, and then moving on to some population dynamic information, which I think is quite important and of interest to me and surprising to a degree compared with what I imagined to see when we looked at the data. Then move on to a little bit about workforce dynamics and industrial composition and how that contributes, or is likely to contribute in future, to community resilience in WA. First point relates to demographic patterns in the Wheatbelt. Here you see the distribution, the age profile of the population of the Wheatbelt compared with WA. The red solid line is an interrogation of the census 2011 compared with the dotted yellow line, which is census 2006. And the red line compares Wheatbelt with the whole of Western Australia. So obviously, if you look at this picture, you reflect on Jack's point at the start. There's clearly a hollowing out of the demographic profile around ages 18 to 30 in the Wheatbelt, and that's not necessarily surprising, not unexpected, and it's not necessarily undesirable, depending upon the depth of that trough. It's clearly a deviation as the young people in Wheatbelt look to move elsewhere for employment opportunities, to see the world, to just explore. But nevertheless, the extent to which one allows that trough to deepen, or the extent to which you hope to fill that trough between 18 and 30, I think is an important driver of the industrial development policy in the Wheatbelt and development strategies for the state more broadly. In terms of the qualifications in of the resident population in the Wheatbelt compared with the rest of WA, again, this point was well made before. We have an educated population in the Wheatbelt. We have strong qualifications across the board. There's a little bit of a difference there between the stock of qualifications at certificate level in the Wheatbelt compared with WA, but of course that can be explained by the relative gap in the younger working age population. Nevertheless, I think that in terms of developing a throughput of vocational qualification, educated people through regional training hubs is helpful to feed the industrial diversification that we hope for the Wheatbelt, and will be an important driver of the region's economic growth and community resilience. So dealing with resident training structures in the Wheatbelt, I think, is important. Second point I wanted to draw attention to relates to the population dynamics in WA and in the Wheatbelt. So we released a report just last week that focused on aspects of workforce and skills in WA. And one of our points of concentration was looking at population mobility, particularly migration into WA from either overseas or interstate. This is a pattern of migration into Western Australia from overseas. The red bars are those who flow in, the arrivals into WA, and the yellow bars are the departures, and the blue line there is the difference, the net migration flows into WA from overseas. So you can see a profile that obviously tracks the economic boom in WA, the resources boom, but Most recently, we're seeing a turn down, that net migration flows into WA from overseas are relatively lower. If you look at interstate migration patterns, you see a similar sort of profile emerging. Same deal, the yellow bars are the departures, the red bars are the arrivals, and the blue line is the net inflow from interstate Australia to Western Australia. And again, you can see that downturn just over the last 18 months, a year and a half. So that's something I think that's germane to the Wheatbelt and how we see the Wheatbelt progressing in terms of its economic trajectory and in terms of the supply of labour. Intriguingly, when you look at the Wheatbelt though, what we did here is we interrogated the population flows into the Wheatbelt. We looked at the census 2011, and of those resident in the Wheatbelt in 2011, we tracked how many of those were resident either in WA or came to WA from interstate, came to WA from overseas to the Wheatbelt, between that and the previous census in 2006. Remarkably, 95% of the 2011 population of the Wheatbelt lived in WA in 2006. Only 3% moved to the Wheatbelt from overseas and 2% moved to the Wheatbelt from interstate. Of that 95%, we find that 28% moved from elsewhere in WA, and the remaining 67% were in the Wheatbelt, both in 2006 and 2011. So that's an interesting contrast to the population dynamic in the rest of Western Australia, and I think, again, that's something which is informative in the context of looking at community patterns, community development in the Wheatbelt. If you look at the net flows of those who remained resident in Western Australia between the two census dates, this charts in absolute terms those who move out and move into each of the major regions of WA. And you can see that the major outflows, the principal outflows across the regions have occurred in the Wheatbelt, in Goldfields, Esperance, along with Perth, with predominant inflows to Peel, to the Pilbara, and to the southwest. Now, these are flows in absolute population terms, but if you then look at flows as a proportion of the 2011 population, you can see that for the Wheatbelt, the sort of churn that we're tracking amounts to around about 17% of the 2011 Wheatbelt population moving out between the two census dates, 14.9% moving in. So that's a reasonably significant flow, but from the rest, the population in the rest of Western Australia. So given that the mobility in terms of workforce and population is largely intrastate rather than interstate or from overseas, we wanted to trace some of the movements in the population across small areas in Western Australia. So this map represents, amongst those who remained resident in WA between 2006 and 11, the proportion of the local population that moved out versus the proportion of the population that moved in. This first chart looks at the movements in to each of the regions. The darker the shade, the stronger the movement into that region. So you can see relatively there's little flow of WA population into, if you like, regional Wheatbelt. Around the Avon Arc you can see a stronger inflow, but that's dwarfed by the sort of inflow that we've seen up north in the Pilbara and the like. If you look at the outflows, again, look at regional Wheatbelt towards the east of the region. Quite a strong outflow there in total terms amongst those who remain resident in WA. If you take one minus the other, you then get a set of net flows. So here we see a map where in red, the stronger the red, the stronger the inflow into the small area. In blue, the stronger the blue, the stronger the outflow. And so look at the panel that represents the Wheatbelt. You see that in large part the areas to the north, apart from the coast, and inland to the east. is seeing a fairly strong net outflow of migrants between Wheatbelt and the rest of the WA, but you see a concentration of population moving into the Avon Arc and towards the coast to the north and the west of the Avon Arc. So I think those dynamics are actually quite informative and something that I think is a relevant point when thinking about patterns of community and the strength of local community resilience. Third point I wanted to focus on relates to population dynamics, with 4 minutes to go. So the workforce dynamics in WA and also in the Wheatbelt, I think, are also quite revealing. This is a map that explores the patterns of working population as a proportion of the overall population. And you can see here that the lighter shades represent the lower working populations as a proportion of total population. And again, in the Wheatbelt, we're looking at amongst the lowest working age population because of the hollowing out of the 18 to 30 age bracket and a relatively large a proportion of people who are moving towards retirement age. If we look at patterns of work, this is one of the findings that we revealed in the Workforce and Skills report released last week on ABS data that looks at employment patterns amongst the 18 to 25 age category across 10 years between 2004 and 2014. We find significant rises in youth unemployment in the Wheatbelt, also in Mandurah and in Perth Southwest, which again is something of a concern. Now, these numbers are relatively volatile because of the relatively low population of youth in Wheatbelt, but nevertheless I think it's a strong contributor to community resilience to have employment opportunities across the board. This is not a remarkable finding, it's something that the Brotherhood and Lawrence noted and the productivity have noted in previous reports this year and last year. So again, in terms of targeting solutions to develop stronger and resilient communities and continuous communities, I think youth unemployment is clearly an issue that's emerging. Final point relates to industry and the industry dynamics in. This is an intriguing picture because it looks to chart the predominant industry in terms of employment across Australia. So we define a predominant industry as one that employs more than 20% of the local labour force. The pale green represents agriculture, and you can see clearly that all around the Wheatbelt as well as the Murray-Darling Basin, the strength of agriculture, that's where the strength of agriculture lies. The terracotta is obviously mining. The darker greens that you see towards the south of Perth and in areas of Adelaide and to the northeast of Melbourne represent manufacturing as the predominant industry of employment. Darwin and ACT, of course, in the light blue, that's the public service. In terms of employment and gross economic value, in WA, these pie charts, these wheels, represent what fraction of the employed workforce are employed in different industrial sectors. From yellow, which represents agriculture, through red at about 1 o'clock on the left-hand wheel that represents mining. And then around the wheel, you'll not be able to see all of these scales from where you sit. However, the important point to note here is that whilst mining in terms of economic value in WA is by far the strongest contributor to the overall economic value in the state, along with construction on the right-hand side at 6 o'clock. When it comes to employment, we're looking at, for mining, employment of around 8 to 9% of the employed workforce, less than some of the other sectors, including retail and construction. Now flip to the Wheatbelt, that's what you're looking at. Interesting point there to note is that mining still retains a very strong contribution to the economic value pumped out by the Wheatbelt, with agriculture coming in second. However, in terms of employment, clearly the agriculture sector dominates at around 28% of employment share in the Wheatbelt community. That's my alarm. Now, clearly agriculture being so important in employment terms, we did a little bit of additional analysis focusing on the gross value of agriculture in the Wheatbelt as a contribution to the agricultural industry in WA overall. The Wheatbelt contributes 37% of the total value of agricultural production in WA. It's dominant when you look at livestock production. Far more dominant, 42% of the total value of production in WA. In terms of agriculture and its employment share, the Wheatbelt contributes a third of the total employment workforce in WA overall. So fully a third of the agricultural employed population in WA comes from this region. But agriculture is declining. This represents the share of the workforce in WA and in Australia overall devoted to agriculture. And from the start of the millennium, where agriculture represented about 5% of employment by share, you see a consistent decline to agriculture now representing just over 2% of the employment share in WA overall. And that clearly has a strong bearing on the opportunities for employment in this area, which has by far the strongest exposure to different patterns of agricultural employment. Last chart, and then I will stop. Just to re-emphasize that point, this chart represents the change in the employment share in agriculture, specifically for each local area in Western Australia. And you can see how cold, in agricultural employment terms, the Wheatbelt has grown. Predominantly shades of blue in that panel represent a reduction in agricultural employment in the Wheatbelt. Something, of course, to be aware of when one compares that with employment growth in the Wheatbelt in sectors such as education and training and healthcare and social assistance. So there's clearly a dynamic, a transition underway in the Wheatbelt, and in order to secure employment opportunities and community resilience, I think catching that wave of transition and ensuring that we've got particularly a young workforce that's educated to speak to the development of these different industrial sectors is really critical to us. Thank you very much. Right.